Hi, this is Lisa Somerville for Divinity Designs. Welcome to another Tuesday's tutorials. In this tutorial, I'm going to be featuring our embossing folders. Embossing folders are a great way to add texture to your cardstock or pattern paper. You can also do different techniques using embossing folders. We carry A2 and slimline embossing folders. The A2 embossing folders are 4 3/4 by 6, and the slimline embossing folders are 4 by 9. We also carry 2 embossing folder die duos. The embossing folder die duos contain embossing folders and coordinating dies. First, I'll show you the embossing folders that we currently carry. Then I'll show you some samples using the embossing folders, and then some embossing folder techniques. First, we have the A2 embossing folders. Again, these folders are 4 3/4 by 6. This is the cross stitch embossing folder, fish embossing folder, flourishes embossing folder, quatrefoil embossing folder, cross embossing folder. And here are the 2 embossing folder die duos, quatrefoil, and you can see the coordinating dies, and crosses. The slimline embossing folders. Again, the slimline embossing folders are 4 by 9. Lattice, wood grain, petals, and the palm leaves embossing folder, which will be released on July 1st. When using our embossing folders, you'll emboss following the directions for your particular die cutting machine. Now I'm going to show you a close-up of the embossing folders done on cardstock. Here's the cross stitch embossing folder, flourishes, the fish embossing folder, the cross embossing folder, and quatrefoil. Again, those are all done on cardstock. Here's the fish embossing folder done on a piece of our pattern paper. And now I'll show you a close-up of the slimline embossing folders done on cardstock. This is the slimline palm leaves embossing folder. Slimline petals, slimline wood grain, and slimline lattice. Our slimline embossing folders coordinate with our slimline dies. Be sure to see our slimline die collection on our website. Now, before I share with you some techniques using our embossing folders, I'm going to show you some finished products using our embossing folders along with additional Divinity Designs products. If you have any questions about the cards shown in this video, you can use the Leave a Message button on our website to send us an email. That's a slimline lattice embossing folder. Here's another card using the slimline embossing folder, along with additional Divinity Designs products. The white panel is embossed using the slimline lattice embossing folder, the cross stitch embossing folder, the fish embossing folder. Next, I have a number of samples using the flourishes embossing folder, After embossing your cardstock or pattern paper using our embossing folders, you can then use our die sets to die cut these panels. When using our shaped dies, be sure to die cut and emboss following the directions for your die cutting machine. Embossing the die will bring out the detail of the dies. That's the raised area that you see around the edge of the cardstock. As I mentioned, embossing folders are a great way to add texture to your cardstock or pattern paper. On these two, I used our embossing folders along with our pattern paper to add texture to the paper. To add a little more dimension to the embossing on your cardstock or your pattern paper, you can use a white pigment ink direct to the top of your embossing. On this panel, after embossing, to add more definition to the raised area of the embossing, I swipe the panel with a white pigment ink. Again, to cut this panel down to size, I can use our matted rectangle or the layering panels that come with the A2 landscape or portrait card base with layered die sets, or our rectangle dies. Even though the slimline dies are designed for our slimline cards, you can cut them down and use them on our A2 cards. You can also use the embossing folders along with glossy cardstock. Shown here is black glossy cardstock and white glossy cardstock. Shown here again, we have the black glossy cardstock and the white glossy cardstock. To achieve the look shown here with the embossing folder, I simply used a sanding block to go over the raised area of the embossing on the black glossy cardstock. You can do the same thing with the white glossy cardstock. After sanding the glossy cardstock, you can add color back to the embossed areas using our blending brushes and ink. By using glossy cardstock along with the embossing folders, it creates a faux metal look. You can also use ink or sprays on the inside of your embossing folders to create different looks with your cardstock and embossing folders. On these two panels, I used the Flourishes embossing folder and added white ink to the inside of the folder, and then embossed following the directions from my die cutting machine. Now on these two panels, I did the wax paper resist technique along with the embossing folders and went back and added ink using our ink blending brushes. So to do the wax paper resist, you're going to use a piece of wax paper, place it within the embossing folder, and then emboss following the directions for your die cutting machine. Then I have 2 pieces of white cardstock. Then I'm going to sandwich the embossed wax paper between the 2 pieces of cardstock. Next, I'll place that between 2 pieces of copy paper. I'm going to use my craft iron on the cotton setting with no steam, and I'm going to apply heat over the copy paper. That's going to transfer the wax to both sides of my cardstock. Now I can remove the copy paper, flip over the cardstock, remove my wax paper, and then I can use ink and our ink blending tools to apply ink over the cardstock. Anywhere where the wax paper transferred to the paper, it will resist the ink. So by sandwiching the wax paper between 2 pieces of cardstock, you get both the positive and the negative of the embossing folder. You can cut those panels down using our die sets. So as you can see, there are many different uses for embossing folders. Besides adding texture to the cardstock or pattern paper, there are many different techniques that you can do using embossing folders. For more inspiration, visit the product pages on our website, Like us on Facebook or follow us on Pinterest and Instagram.